April 1775. The smoke cleared to reveal a terrifying truth. This was no longer a protest, but a war. Without an army or a navy, the colonies had challenged the world's most powerful empire. The question wasn't if Britain would respond, but how hard they would strike back. A rebellion without an army. In the days after Lexington and Concord, thousands of colonial militiamen poured into Massachusetts. They came from farms, from towns, from villages across New England. Within weeks, more than 15,000 armed men surrounded the British-controlled city of Boston. From a distance, it looked like an army. But in reality, it was something very different. These men were not professional soldiers. They brought their own weapons, their own supplies, their own rules. Some units trained regularly, others had little experience. There was no unified command, no standard discipline, no clear chain of authority. They were volunteers, and they could leave whenever they wanted. What had formed around Boston was not an army. It was a gathering of determined but unorganized resistance. And against them stood the British Empire, the power of the British Empire. In 1775, Britain was the world's dominant military power. Its navy ruled the seas. Its army was experienced, disciplined, and battle-tested. British soldiers had fought across Europe, North America, and beyond. They were trained to march in formation, to fire coordinated volleys, to maintain order under pressure. And most importantly, they were backed by a global empire. Britain could send reinforcements, supplies, weapons, ships, money. The colonies could do none of those things at scale. To British leaders, the situation seemed straightforward. This was not a war. It was a rebellion, and rebellions could be crushed. But what British leaders did not fully understand was how far the situation had already escalated. King and Parliament respond. News of the fighting reached London weeks later. At first, British officials struggled to believe the reports. Colonial militias had fired on British troops. British soldiers had been killed. To many in Parliament, it sounded impossible. But as more information arrived, the truth became clear. The American colonies were in open rebellion. King George III was furious. In August 1775, he issued a formal declaration. The colonies were in a state of rebellion, and those involved were considered traitors. This was a critical turning point, because once the king declared rebellion, there would be no easy compromise, no quiet resolution. The British government began preparing for a full military response. More troops were ordered to America, more ships were mobilized, and plans were made to crush the uprising quickly, before it could spread further. But Britain faced one problem: distance. It took weeks, sometimes months, for troops and supplies to cross the Atlantic. And by the time reinforcements arrived, the situation on the ground had already changed. The Second Continental Congress. While Britain prepared for war, the colonies faced a different challenge. They needed to decide who they were. Were they still loyal subjects of the king, or were they now something else? In May 1775, delegates from the colonies gathered once again in Philadelphia. This meeting became known as the Second Continental Congress. It was not a government in the modern sense, but it would soon take on that role. The delegates faced an impossible situation. War had already begun, but independence had not been declared. Many still hoped for reconciliation with Britain. Others believed that moment had already passed. The colonies stood at a crossroads, and their next decision would shape everything that followed, creating an army from nothing. The first major problem was obvious. If the colonies were going to fight Britain, they needed a real army, not just scattered militias, but a unified, organized force. On June 14, 1775, the Continental Congress made a historic decision. They created the Continental Army. This was a bold move, because it transformed a local rebellion into a coordinated military effort. But creating an army on paper was one thing. Building one in reality was something else entirely. There were immediate challenges. Who would lead it? How would it be funded? How would soldiers be trained? How would supplies be secured? And most importantly, would the colonies actually support it? Because not everyone was committed to fighting Britain. Even now, loyalty was divided. The choice of George Washington. To lead the new army, Congress needed someone with experience, someone respected, someone who could unite the colonies. They chose a man from Virginia, a plantation owner, a former British officer, a man with both military experience and political credibility, George Washington. At the time, Washington was not yet a legend. He had fought in the French and Indian War. He had experience commanding troops, but he had never led an army of this scale. Still, he possessed something equally important: presence, discipline, and a reputation for integrity. On June 15, 1775, Washington was appointed Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. He accepted the role with humility and deep awareness of the challenge ahead, because Washington understood something many others did not. This war would not be easy, and victory was far from guaranteed. An army in name only. When Washington arrived near Boston in July 1775, he was shocked by what he saw. The army he had been chosen to lead was barely an army at all. Soldiers lacked uniforms. Many had no proper training. Weapons were inconsistent. Supplies were limited. Gunpowder was dangerously low. There was little discipline. Units operated independently. Some soldiers refused orders. Others went home when their enlistments ended. Washington faced a nearly impossible task. He had to transform a loose collection of militias into a professional fighting force, while preparing to face the British Army at the same time. And time was not on his side, because the British were already preparing to strike. The first major clash, Bunker Hill. Even before Washington fully took command, a major battle had already taken place. In June 1775, colonial forces learned that British troops planned to seize high ground near Boston. Two key hills overlooked the city, Breed's Hill and Bunker Hill. Control of these hills would provide a strategic advantage. So under cover of darkness, colonial forces moved to occupy the heights. They began building fortifications overnight. By morning, British commanders were stunned. Colonial troops were already in position. The British decided to attack. Wave after wave of British soldiers marched uphill toward colonial defenses. The fighting was brutal. Colonial forces held their fire until the British were dangerously close. Then they unleashed devastating volleys. The British advanced again and again, each time suffering heavy losses. Finally, on the third assault, colonial forces began to run out of ammunition. With no bullets left, they were forced to retreat. The British captured the hill. But the victory came at a devastating cost. Over 1,000 British casualties, compared to about 400 colonial losses. The message was clear. The colonists could fight, and they could inflict serious damage. A war no one could control. The Battle of Bunker Hill changed how both sides saw the war. For the British, it was a warning. This would not be an easy suppression of rebellion. For the colonies, it was a signal of possibility. They could stand against the British Army, but it also revealed a harsh truth. Without proper supplies, organization, and leadership, they could not sustain a prolonged fight. Meanwhile, back in Philadelphia, Congress made one last attempt to avoid full-scale war. They sent a final appeal to the king. It became known as the Olive Branch Petition. In it, the colonies declared their loyalty. They asked for peace, for compromise, for recognition of their rights. But the petition arrived too late. King George III refused to consider it. In his eyes, the colonies were already in rebellion, and rebellion had only one answer: force. Britain prepares to crush the revolution. By late 1775, Britain was fully committed to war. Thousands of additional troops were sent across the Atlantic. More ships, more weapons, more resources. British strategy was clear: isolate New England, capture major cities, destroy the Continental Army, and restore control. But Britain also made a critical assumption: that the colonies were divided, that loyalists, colonists still loyal to the crown, would rise up and support British forces. That assumption would shape British strategy moving forward, but it would not play out as expected. Because while the colonies were divided, the violence of war was beginning to change minds. Ending. By the end of 1775, the situation was clear. The American colonies were at war with Britain, but they were not ready. They had no strong central government, no stable funding, no navy, and an army that barely held together. Across the ocean, Britain prepared to unleash its full military power. The imbalance was overwhelming. On paper, the outcome seemed inevitable. The rebellion should have been crushed, quickly, decisively. But wars are not fought on paper. They are fought by people, by decisions, by moments, and sometimes by belief. In our next episode, we follow George Washington as he attempts the impossible: to turn a fragile, inexperienced force into an army capable of standing against an empire, because the survival of the revolution now depended on him. Top of form. Subscribe to Hidden History Fact Vault.